Hello everyone and welcome back to the Nordic Sound channel. I know it's been a minute since I've done a video like this, but I've been getting settled into my new semester, into the flow of things, but today I've got a video for you guys that I've been thinking about for quite some time because, as you know, in doing the work for this channel, I talk to quite a few dark folk musicians, be they newcomers or people who've been around the scene for quite some time. And this weird sentiment that I hear shared by both performers and listeners of dark folk, regardless of where you are on that spectrum, if you're new to it or you've been in this scene for quite a while, I'm surprised at how many people seem to believe that dark folk is either not evolving or has nothing exciting or nothing new going on, which is really interesting to me because, at first it seems like an easy thing to agree with, but the more you pay attention to the newcomers, the upstarts in the genre, the more potential I think that you start to notice in the dark folk scene. So I figured that I would put a list together of 5 dark folk musicians, bands, acts, whatever you want to call them, who I think showed the potential and a pretty bright future for dark folk. So first up for you guys today, I've got a musician based out of the UK whose project goes by the name of Anhaga. Anhaga has actually been a follower of the channel for some time, so out of genuine curiosity, I checked out his music, and I gotta say, it blew me away. He only has one album out at the moment titled World, or Worlds, however you pronounce that. And what really struck me about his music is that he somehow strikes this nice hybrid point between Vardruna and high-lung sound, while at the same time not being at all derivative. In other words, he takes this style of music that we all have come to know and love and makes it his own, which to me is the crucial part of starting a dark folk project. The last thing you want to be, we talked about this in my interview with Viavaki, the last thing you want to do is get into dark folk because you want to be like Vardruna, because you want to be like high-lung. The best thing to do is take inspiration where you can, but to ultimately do your own thing, and that's what Anhaga does. His soundscape is pretty unique. As far as I understand, it is inspired by the landscape around him in the UK. I know the guy loves ancient history. He's definitely inspired by the barrows, the stone art, and the various stone monuments around him in the UK. And so he takes his own landscape around him and makes music that is inspired by that. And I can never put my finger on what makes me feel this way when I listen to his music, but his music definitely evokes Stone Agey aspects and aesthetics. When I listen to his music, I feel like I'm back in the Stone Age. That's what I'm trying to say. Oh, one more thing. For those of you who have asked me for recommendations of bands in the dark folk genre that sing in English, Anhaga has quite a few verses or refrains that are in English. So if any of these things tick boxes for you, Stone Age aesthetics, a hybrid between Vardruna and high-lung, but something that's fresh and unique to the musician who's making the music, and you want to sing along in English sometimes, I cannot recommend Anhaga enough. Just a few quick suggestions on tracks from his first album, World. A Piece of the Sky is, I think, him at his most unique. But Eruro is a track that really channels Kai energy from high-lung, again, in a way that's not derivative, but when I listen to him, I'm just like, this feels like my favorite parts in, let's say, Hamra Hipir, which we never get enough of. So if any of this ticks boxes for you, please check out Anhaga's World. So next up, I've got a band for you guys that I actually interviewed recently, and that interview will be up in a few weeks, and that is Dur of France, who just put out their first EP, Reza. And if you guys have been following me on social media at all, you know that I have been pretty into this album since it came out and to this group. Because you guys know that one of my biggest hangups with dark folk is not that it's boring, but more so that it lacks an emotional dynamic range. What do I mean by that? Well, it's kind of in the name. Dark folk makes people think that dark folk needs to be minor, slow, throat singing, or at least baritone singing. And while there's more than enough room for that, sometimes, especially if you listen to the sheer amount of music that I do just for the work I do on this channel, it definitely starts to all blend together. And I think that's because people are hesitant to explore other emotional aspects of dark folk. Because I will say with confidence, as someone who does read and talk and research a lot about dark folk in this genre of music, dark folk seems to be a catch-all term for just like heathen or pagan music in general. And you guys have heard me rant about this enough, but like heathenry or paganism or ancient cultures were not always playing music like they were at a funeral. Music is supposed to be an uplifting aspect of social life, and that is an aspect of dark folk or heathen music that I really don't think it's been explored enough until Reza came along. Now, on Reza, you do have tracks like Sleipnir that are on the slower, darker side, but then you've got tracks like Wisla, which feels like someone just started some random sing-along in a medieval tavern. It's just so much fun. There's even laughing in the background. You can just tell that these musicians are having a good fucking time while they're making music. And that fun, that laughter is infectious. And this also just comes down to the fact that the musicians of this band are both incredibly talented and highly charismatic too. It was a blast talking to them. So you've got the founder Tim, who plays the saz, and this is where I should emphasize that Blauthdir, they got their initial inspiration from Nordic stuff, but they don't imprison themselves within the walls of Nordic. And the saz, I can't remember if it's a Balkan instrument. I think it's Balkan, but at the very least, it's not Nordic, okay? So you're already going to hear something new, but then the percussionist has just this way with the drum that is incredibly captivating. And then the frontmen, you have Melahan and you have Nea. Nea's an incredible singer, but Melahan, he just has this bard energy. Like, the bard that gets invited to the D&D table, that's his vibe. And that comes through in the music. And I think I've gushed about it enough at this point, but if you are looking for dark folk that has a more fun side to it, is actually happy, and you can tell that the musicians are just having a good time while they're playing the music, I cannot recommend Blauthdir's Reza enough. Definitely a band to keep an eye on. If you're looking for a track just to check out, Wisla, the last track on their EP, I'd be very surprised if you weren't an immediate fan. So next up, we have a band that I've actually had on the channel before, and I share their stuff pretty often on Instagram, and that is Afton Storm with their first EP, Und Blut. Afton Storm, they are doing something fresh but familiar. So they are still very solidly in dark folk. Sorry if you can hear Cricket fighting his bell. It's just how he's keeping himself occupied right now. But in Afton Storm's Und Blut, you hear this familiar dark folk soundscape, but there's a freshness to it in both Dan's approach to songwriting. Dan's voice itself, I just mentioned that dark folk tends to just be nothing but baritone vocal ranges for men. Dan has more of a tenor, and that is a breath of fresh air to me in dark folk. But there's also an interesting use of percussion that is more syncopated and intricate than we're used to hearing in dark folk. And of course, most importantly, I think the most iconic part of Afton Storm's music is Dan is not your average talharpa player. He actually, like, how can I say this without sounding like an asshole? Actually, let's say it in his words in the interview. He doesn't just play the same 3 goddamn notes in his music. But the way that I would put it is that Dan looks at the talharpa as an instrument that is capable of so much more than what we typically hear from it. And he's even designing a talharpa course. That's something to look out for. And he just plays the talharpa in a pretty virtuosic manner that really explores the capabilities of that instrument. So, all in all, if you are looking for a dark folk band that is very solidly in a familiar dark folk soundscape, but they are doing something new and interesting within those parameters, definitely check out Afton Storm, just in the way of vocals, percussion, and the way that Dan just shreds the talharpa. I'd be very surprised if any fan of dark folk listened to their new EP, Und Blut, and didn't fall in love pretty quickly. So, a track to check out on that album, if you just want to quick and dirty, I want to just check out one tune, is Mit Indrutocht, is a pretty good track, and that's the one that I find myself listening to the most, so definitely worth checking out. So next up, number 4 on this list, we have Rising Finnish Sweethearts Noidwin. I hope I didn't butcher that as much as I think I did, who just put out a new EP called Alainen, or Alinen. This is a Finnish duo that features the talharpa, the cantel, vocals, and a lot of ambience, like synthesized ambience that really sets the mood. Their music centers around Finnish mythology and Finnish heathenism. Wisdom of Odin, he changed his YouTube channel's name. I don't know, I think he just changed it to his name, which I don't know off the top of my head. He just did a video with them, so please go check that out. Because in dark folk, especially in like the Nordic dark folk, Finland just does not get enough time in the spotlight. I've talked to a few Finnish folks that think that it's just a Finnish person's reluctance to talk about themselves, which is pretty understandable. But Noidwin and just Finnish dark folk in general, I feel like there's just so much potential there in Finnish mythology and Finnish folklore that it's just really cool to see a band like Noidwin, and also there's Gull, who I'm just going to sort of bundle up into this. These are two Finnish bands that are exploring dark folk from a Finnish perspective. And as I mentioned in the Viavaki interview, we don't get enough of the Icelandic perspective. Equally so, I think we don't get nearly enough of the Finnish perspective. So if the Finnish perspective interests you at all, definitely check out Noidwin's Alainen or the band Gull while you are at it. And I think that the music will speak for itself in terms of what you see differently when you look at this genre from a different perspective. So next up for you guys, I'm going to flip the tables with a Celtic dark folk group, and this is really going to betray my lack of Romance language skills. Cuelebre and their new album Oinos. The reason I am bringing a Celtic dark folk band into this conversation is because Celtic folk and Celtic pagany music definitely had its time to shine in the early 2000s, and I think you can really see that with the popularity of early Helvete. But as the Nordic stuff got popular, it kind of started to overshadow or usurp the Celtic side of things, which I think is a real shame because there's more than enough room for both the Nordic and the Celtic, and the Baltic and the Balkan for that matter, and any other in or ick that I haven't mentioned. There's more than enough room for all kinds of dark folk and all cultural heritages to be present in the dark folk scene. But because the Nordic side of things started to get more popular, Celtic bands who were doing this dark folk thing just sort of got less common. So I just wanted to bring up a Celtic dark folk bands to continue the trend that I was talking about with both Anhaga from the UK and Noidwin and Gull from Finland. And that is just broadening our horizons outside of the Nordics. And this is coming from the Nordic Sound Channel guy. So Cuelebre uses a lot of familiar Celtic melodies as well as Celtic rhythms, like those syncopated 6/8 rhythms that are pretty infectious. I love their instrumentation. It's primarily, they've got some wind instruments, but then they've also got, I'm pretty sure if I'm remembering correctly, they do have a talharpa. But then they have just the Celtic percussion, which I do think is where Celtic dark folk shines the most, is with their percussion and their use of wind instruments for that matter. So in their album Oinos, you are sort of taken through this ancient medieval Celtic soundscape with a really talented both male and female vocalist, as is getting pretty common with dark folk bands, as they said in Viavaki, so it's not just a bunch of dudes grunting in a room with each other. But anyway, Cuelebre with Oinos, I think, is going to offer you who feel like dark folk is getting a little stale because you're having trouble getting outside the Nordic side of things. I think if you give Cuelebre and their album Oinos a chance, you will start to see, again, the amount of potential in the Celtic perspective on dark folk. So, again, there's never enough Celtic dark folk, and I hope to see more in the future, but for now, it is good to see fresh blood in the form of Cuelebre. And so guys, that is my list of 5 dark folk bands that I have fallen in love with in the last year that I just wanted to share with you guys in a concise little list, especially for those of you who are starting to lament how stale dark folk is getting. I would say maybe you're just not looking in the right places. So hopefully you guys give any of these bands a listen. They more than earn it, more than deserve it. I hope to have every single band on this list, not only on the channel at some point, but also I hope to see them at Midgardsblot, perhaps in the Gildehallen. Got a whole separate video for bands I would love to see play in the Gildehallen next year. So anyway, you guys let me know any bands that I have left out of the list, because I am but one mortal man. I cannot develop encyclopedic knowledge of new dark folk bands. So if you've got any bands that you've been listening to that you think others should give a listen, leave them down in the comments. I would love to hear them for my own sake, but I'm sure others who have watched to this point in the video would too. So thank you guys for watching. Hope you give these bands a listen. They've deserved it, and I will see you guys next time on the Nordic Sound Channel.